We'll start with some information on the bottom line. And if you aren't familiar with the Case Manager Resources website, this section is designed to provide the compliance information from the Department of Education related to what we have to have in our paperwork. So for today, or for this topic, we're talking about goals and objectives. And so the bottom line, as you can see here, is that the goals need to be individualized for each student. They need to be updated each year, at least one each year, and they also need to be measurable and meaningful. They need to be designed to meet the students' their needs that result from their disability, and they need to be designed to meet other educational needs, and they also need to have 2 measurable benchmarks or objectives. So that's what we have to do. So this resource here is designed to kind of give you more information on how exactly you accomplish that. So we're going to talk through an overview of some of the things on this page that allow you to accomplish those bottom lines and those requirements. And then we're going to talk through exactly how you do that and what that looks like. So some of the tools that you might come to use when you're writing compliant goals and objectives are related to measurement. And so remember, one of the requirements that we have is to make sure that the goals are measurable and meaningful. So in order to accomplish that, we have resources available to measure goals. And depending on the area that you're writing the goal in, there could be different resources available to you to use those. So those are kind of listed here as far as different topical areas, and then some tools that you could use. Additionally, we have some resources related to setting an appropriate target. So if you're kind of thinking that you need to write a literacy goal, well, how do you know exactly where the student should be performing? And how do you kind of use some objective information instead of just, well, I think, maybe we should be here. We do have some objective information that you can reference to determine kind of the target of where you want the student to be performing. And that's actually a different section of this course, this particular module of the IEP development course. I'm not going to go in depth in that now, but you will be getting it in a future section of this module. The next component here is actually writing the goal in the IEP. And so this is where we've got some really good resources, templates actually, related to PLAFs and goals and objectives. So that's where this is located here under Go-To Tools in writing the goal in the IEP. So I will come back to that when I demonstrate exactly how to do that in SpEd forms. But we're going to move into some more information here on the website. So the next section here is kind of like the bigger picture related to writing goals and progress monitoring those goals to determine if a student is actually making progress on what we want them to be able to accomplish. So if you're ready to dig a little bit more deeply into that, there is a really awesome video here that kind of outlines the whole process. Here's kind of a visual that essentially outlines what this video is about, but this graphic can be useful in kind of setting the stage. We're not going to take the time to watch the video, but just know that it's available if you want to dig a little bit deeper into that. So essentially, when you're writing an IEP goal, what you need to do first is figure out the student's needs and then what skills you will teach them. And so we do that in a variety of ways, but basically we got to understand where the student is currently performing. So in the IEP, we call that the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, otherwise known lovingly as the PLAF. And a lot of times we're going to get that information either from an evaluation report, but if they're not due for an evaluation, if we're not required to do one, then we can just get that information from how they've done on previous IEP goals. Hopefully have some progress monitoring data, how they've been doing in their classes, just observations. There's lots of different ways that we can figure out how the student is performing and what needs they have, and then what we're going to plan on teaching them. Then what we want to do is figure out what skills do you want to measure? So what exactly about that area of reading is challenging for the student, for example? So again, kind of thinking about the flow of what the student needs, and then what exactly do you want to measure? So we're not necessarily prioritizing skills. I mean, we can't do everything, but we are kind of choosing what is going to have the most bang for the buck, essentially. So if I use the same example of literacy, if the student is really struggling with reading, what is it about reading that's causing them kind of the biggest challenge? What is the real problem? Is it that they're really struggling to comprehend what they read? Like they can read fairly fluently and accurately, but they really struggle to understand it. Maybe they understand it, but they have trouble applying it. Or maybe it's a foundational skill where they're just really struggling to kind of read fluently and accurately. And so digging a little bit deeper into why that is happening. So again, you can use that kind of problem identification situation when it comes to anything related to a student's performance. And then just kind of highlighting here too that in some areas we might not have a goal. So for example, like transportation might be an area of need for the student. Maybe they're high school age and they're kind of working on independent skills, accessing their community. And so they're gonna, need some, they need to improve in transportation, but really that's not a huge component of what you're going to be writing a goal around. It might be something you're thinking about and you're checking in on and you're having conversation about, but it's not necessarily something where you would write a goal. So once you've kind of figured out the needs of the student, and once you've kind of figured out what skills you want to measure, then the next thing to kind of think about, and this all sort of is fluid, it doesn't necessarily kind of work super separately, but you want to think about what tools you're going to use and like how you're going to be collecting that data. So there are lots and lots of resources and information kind of related to that, because data collection it's a whole nother kind of component of providing a student with a free and appropriate public education. There's a lot of nuances and details that go into that. But when you're thinking about, when you're writing a goal, you want to think about whether, what you're writing is actually going to be able to be measured. Like, what are you going to be measuring? And then how are you going to be measuring it? So kind of going back to that literacy example that I gave previously, depending on what you decide the needs are and depending on what you identify as the skills you want to teach, you can kind of think about, which areas are you going to measure? Are you going to be looking at the rate? So how like in a given time frame, kind of how quickly or the rate at which they produce something? Or you're going to be looking potentially at accuracy. So how are they kind of doing success-wise? You can also look at the quality of something. So again, relating to reading, maybe you're looking at comprehension, and maybe you're looking at application. So how successful are they at being able to kind of comprehend information or apply information? Additionally, you might look at their level of independence. How long does it take them to do something? These are a little bit kind of divergent from reading, but hopefully you kind of get the idea of the different kinds of things that you would want to measure. Then you're going to think about what are you going to measure? So what are you going to use in order to figure that out? And there's lots of different options. I think in the past we have a lot of kind of like using our GOM probes or something related to the FastBridge suite, especially in academics, but those might not be appropriate kind of given where the student's level of performance is. And so you might want to think about something else. And so this is sort of a list of other ways that you could take a look. I think the number one thing to remember when you're looking at a goal, looking at writing a goal, is making sure that you're using numbers. Some way you need to be able to use numbers to be able to then quantify it and be able to measure it. So, if you're going to be using a rating scale or a points sheet or a rubric, you're going to want to make sure that you have some kind of a rating that is able to correspond with a number, so then you can then use that information as you start to progress monitor. So once you kind of figure out what you're going to use to measure the student's performance, the next question is, who is going to collect the information? Usually it's a special education teacher or a paraprofessional. Sometimes it might be the classroom teacher, but in any case, who's going to collect the data, and then how often are you going to be collecting it? Sometimes the measure itself has a recommended kind of time frame of of when they want the data collected, just because it's based on kind of some more scientific principles. But that frequency can kind of be, in some cases, kind of left up to you as the case manager to determine what makes the most sense. The next thing that you're going to want to do then is follow through on collecting the data. So you wrote the goal, you know that it's measurable, you know how you're going to monitor it, and then you know you've identified who is doing that monitoring. So you just want to make sure that you do that. And there's lots of different ways to collect the data. So I've seen clipboard systems, binder systems. It might be like one day a week you're going to collect data on reading on Monday, and then you're going to do data on math on Tuesday, and we're going to do behavior on Wednesday and Thursday, and then send out, general education teacher DBRs or point sheets on Friday. Like, you can kind of come up with whatever system makes the most sense for you. And you'll probably need to build that over time, but figuring out like exactly how you're going to collect the data. Then you're going to want to graph the data. And so this is where EduClimber comes in, and that's kind of a whole nother topic, but essentially walking through, these components. And then lastly, working to visually analyze the data and make those database decisions. So we'll get more into this specifically in some progress monitoring trainings and some other opportunities, but in a nutshell, that's kind of the things that you need to think about when you are kind of like working on a goal. So just want to highlight again, spoiler alert here, there is a short quiz, and what are those kind of main things that you need to think about before you write a goal is, identifying the needs, figuring out what skills you want to measure, and then what tools are you planning on using, and like what are those logistics of collecting the data. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about those parts of a goal. And these are some requirements that we need to make sure we have in order for that goal to be meaningful and measurable. So the four required components of a goal in order for it to be compliant include the time frame. So when do we want that goal to be achieved? And typically this is going to be a year out from whenever you're writing the IEP. So for an annual IEP, it's almost always a year out. There are some times where you might have a goal with a shorter timeline. For example, if you're doing an amendment and adding a goal in the middle of the year and it's going to end at the same time as the annual IEP, that would be an example. It could be, if a student moves in and maybe they come in at a different timeline, and you're going to want to adjust that a little bit. So you can have this be different than 1 year, but almost always they're going to be 1 year, and the year is kind of based on that annual IEP date. Also, the condition. So when are kind of like what's going to be happening when you're measuring the students' performance? Are they going to be in a special education classroom? Are they going to be in a general education classroom? Are they going to be given a prompt and then need to respond to that prompt? Is someone reading them something? So just sort of that idea of like what's happening around sort of the skill that you're kind of measuring and targeting. And then the behavior is, what behavior or skill are you measuring? So again, that kind of goes back to, are you doing literacy? And if you are doing literacy, then what component? Is it fluency, or is it comprehension? Is it application? And then what aspect? So are you looking at the quality? Are you looking at their rate? That kind of thing. So again, you can reference some of those considerations up here in this section that we just reviewed to kind of help guide you through answering that question. And then lastly, the criterion. And so this is where the numbers come into play. So you're going to kind of answer, how are we going to know if that goal has been achieved? And so we want to also highlight an increase. It's very rare that we can't measure something in an increase. So even when you're talking about behavior, we don't want to focus on what we don't want the student to do. We want to focus on what we do want them to do. So if a student has a lot of trouble following instructions, then we're going to talk about how frequently we want them to follow instructions. If they have, some language that we don't like and maybe they're blurting a lot, we want to focus on, how frequently they're going to be engaging in appropriate conversation in a classroom, just kind of as an example. So here we have what we like to call the IEP goal formula. And so if you kind of utilize, and I'm going to show you some templates in a minute where this is kind of already crafted for you, so you don't really even need to kind of think about it. But essentially, like we've got, by the certain due date. So that's going to be the time frame when, whatever the measurement condition is, when provided a prompt in the special education setting, the student will increase their ability to produce correct word sequences from 30 to 60. And then who's going to measure it and like how you're going to measure it. So as measured by writing probes, and then how often, so weekly, by the special education teacher. So if you follow this formula here, you will meet all of these kind of required parts of the goal, and you can be confident that your goal is going to be compliant. Down here we have a few examples. I'll just pop this open so you can kind of see where these live, but we're not going to go through those just for the sake of time. But these are some examples that you could potentially reference. And then the last thing that we end with here are the difference between benchmarks and objectives. And so if you remember back at the top when we were talking about the bottom line, every goal needs to have at least 2 objectives. And so most of the time what we're actually writing are called benchmarks. We just sort of refer to them as objectives, and that can get a little bit confusing. But really what that is by kind of like taking those little checkpoints at a couple of times throughout the course of the year, and then seeing how the student is performing. So for example, if you are working on, let's say, reading comprehension, and the student is currently reading 45 words correct per minute, and their goal is to get to 90 words correct per minute, then you're going to take a look a couple of different times throughout the year, and maybe their first sort of benchmark would be that you want them to be reading 60 words correct per minute. So we're going to go from 45 to 60, and then we're going to go from 60 to 75, and then we're going to go from 75 to 90. So that would be kind of an example of how those benchmarks work. An objective is actually kind of something that you usually see coming into play when a student is learning a skill. So for example, if it's a student who is, let's say, learning how to brush their teeth independently, they're going to first, maybe their first objective would be to turn on the water. And then they would need to grab their toothbrush, and then they would need to put the toothpaste on their toothbrush, and so on and so forth. And you're going to assign a timeline to when that student can do those skills independently. Same thing like when you're kind of working toward like acquiring a behavior or engaging in implementing a replacement behavior. So those, you can absolutely write those objectives and kind of do it. We call that like a task analysis. So you're you're looking at the whole structure of a task and kind of breaking it down into those individual skills. So just know that's an option, but the vast majority of time you're going to be utilizing benchmarks. But I just want to highlight the difference between those because they're called objectives, but really what we're doing are benchmarks, and that can sometimes get confusing. Down here, we do have some frequently asked questions. And again, just know that this is sort of your page on Case Manager Resources, highlighting where all of the different things are located when you're going to be working on writing compliant goals and objectives. So the last kind of component of this general training is going to be on how you can use some of the templates that we have for present levels of academic achievement and functional performance and goals, and then put that information into SpEd forms. So you can see that I'm still on the goal page here, and I'm going to go down here to this Go to Tools section, and we're gonna actually focus right now on writing the goal in the IEP. And so what you're going to see linked in here are the actual templates that we have for all of these different areas. And so I'm going to just choose, I will choose, I don't know, behavior. So I'm going to pop this open, and then the other thing that I'm going to make sure that I do is have my students' file in SpEd forms open. So I'm going to go to our onboarding student. This is a fake student that we have for training purposes. And I'm going to go to his, I think we said that onboarding is a male. So I'm going to go to his IEP, and then I'm going to go to the goals section. And what I'm going to be writing a goal in is, let's say, I'm just going to find one here, something. How about accepting help? I could actually probably use a goal in that area as well. So onboarding is struggling with accepting help. And so I'm going to come down here and kind of take a look. And obviously, you know, I probably would have done this before doing a recording for people to train them. But under accepting help, you know, I would read through this and say, yeah, that totally fits the need that this student has and the skills that we're working to develop. And so in this goals page, you can see that onboarding, I already worked on a goal here. And so I'm going to add a goal for accepting help. And so I choose this option here, add a goal. And then the category that I'm going to select is behavioral skills. And then the PLAF, or the general kind of information about how my student is doing, is also located here. And so I'm going to highlight this information here all the way up to kind of that area where I see measurable annual goal. I am going to copy it, and then I'm going to bring it over here, and I'm going to paste that in. I'll just use my keyboard shortcut. So then I've got this in my IEP. I'm going to make sure to save it. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to use this goal that I liked for accepting help. And so again, I will highlight it, and I'm using the keyboard shortcuts on I use a Mac, and it's Control C for copy and then Control V to paste. And I will again save it because SpEd forms can be a little finicky. We don't want to lose our hard work. And then I'm going to also copy over this benchmark, otherwise known as an objective in SpEd forms. And so if I go here, it says add new objective. So I'm going to put that one in, and then I know that I need to be measuring this 3 times a year. And the reason that I know that is because hypothetically in this situation, I work at a high school and we do report cards on the trimester. And so I'm going to make sure that I have information to report out on this IEP 3 times a year. And that would have been listed on that services, or on the student information page on the front page of the IEP, how frequently. So if you're ever not really sure how many objectives you need, remember you need to have at least 2. You can have more than 2, but you need to have at least 2. And then the last section that you'll see here is how are we going to be, you know, measuring the progress. And so that is also listed here as well. And so I'm going to copy that, again, Control C on my Mac, and then I'll Control V, paste it in there, and click Save. And so now I have this templated information for the goal of accepting help for my student onboarding, and I can go back and I can customize it. So I can put, you know, the student's name in kind of these spots where I see XXX. And then when I get down to the measurable annual goal, what I hope you notice is that it follows this goal formula that we talked about earlier. So this formula right here is how this goal is written as well. So you can just customize the information. You'll need to have their baseline and their target on this particular skill, and then you can kind of go from there. So that is, again, I'll highlight just kind of quickly how you're going to access these templates and how you can copy and paste them in. So it's writing the goal in the IEP is a section on the Case Manager Resources website, and then you can choose the area. And actually, what I want to show you here is that this resource, once you open it one time, so you can see that I'm in the SEL section here, but it also contains all of the information for literacy, math, daily living, motor, employability, more of those functional skills, and then speech language. So you don't have to, you could theoretically go back and open, now I want to do a literacy goal, but it's basically the exact same document. So once you have it open one time, you kind of can switch then between the different areas. You don't have to go back to the website. So that is kind of essentially how to use those templates and paste them into SpEd forms. All right, this last section of this tutorial is really how to kind of measure once you've put a goal into an IEP, if you want to do a self-check. And this isn't required. This is, just if you want to know for certain that what you're writing and putting into your IEP is compliant, that it's going to meet all of these bottom line components. One of the great ways to do that is to access what we call the CIMP rubric. So CIMP, C-I-M-P, stands for Continuous Improvement Monitoring Process. And that's an internal activity that we do to kind of, just do like essentially a quality check and provide feedback on paperwork to case managers in our district. And so I just want to highlight where you can access this resource and kind of encourage you to think about printing out a copy and having it at your desk or bookmarking it on the website, whatever kind of makes the most sense for how you process information. So I believe that the CIMP rubric is in the ongoing section. And it's under CIMP and compliance monitoring. So the other place that you can get that is to kind of go to this drop down menu, and then it's kind of located here in the last section. So either one of those I can click on. And then these rubrics are located here. And so what you'll see is that we have one for the IEP, and we also have one for the evaluation summary report. So since we're talking about goals and objectives, I'm going to choose the rubric for the IEP, and then I'm going to scroll down. So we have a PLAF section, and then I'm going to scroll down to this section here on goals and objectives. And you can see these are the criterion that we want to accomplish. And then the rating that you get kind of depending on, what your goal and what your objective look like. So I'm not going to go through exactly like how to use this or apply it to the goal that I wrote. I just want you to be aware that this is a resource that's available to you. And when we do CIMP, those of us at SpEd, when we kind of engage in that CIMP process in January, that's the rubric that we're using when we go through your IEPs. So that concludes kind of the big bulk of the training on writing compliant goals and objectives.